When most people think of ancient Egypt, they think about pyramids, mummies, and pharaohs. However, one interesting part of Egyptian history has to do with their advanced medical practices. The ancient Egyptians were known for performing all sorts of operations that would put modern doctors to shame. They performed complex surgeries without anesthesia and made instruments that would be recognizable even today. One of the more shocking procedures that they developed was brain surgery. The idea of drilling a hole into someone's skull is terrifying in itself, but when it comes to removing parts of the brain, things become even more complicated. The Egyptians kept detailed records of many of their medical cases, allowing researchers to better understand what their doctors did. But it seems like there may have been a bit of confusion regarding this one procedure. What did the ancient Egyptians really do during these surgeries? Did they actually remove parts of the brain, or was it all just a big mistake? Let's take a look at some of the evidence to find out. Trepanation. The first thing that we should discuss is the process of trepanation. This was the practice of drilling a hole into the skull. While this sounds absolutely terrifying, it wasn't always done with malicious intent. In fact, sometimes it was actually a necessary part of healing. Sometimes an injury might cause the bone of the skull to break and cut into the brain. The only way to treat this kind of wound would be to cut away the broken pieces of the bone so the brain could heal properly. This is actually something that doctors still do today. If someone gets a bad head injury and part of their skull is missing, doctors will step in to perform a craniotomy, which is essentially the same thing as the Egyptians were doing thousands of years ago. In other situations, trepanation was used to treat other kinds of illnesses. For example, if someone had a bad case of epilepsy, they might undergo the procedure to have a part of their skull removed. Doctors believed that by removing part of the skull, they could free the mind from whatever evil spirit was causing the seizures. It makes sense that the Egyptians would have practiced this form of treatment, since they believed that the human body was made up of multiple parts, including the heart, lungs, kidneys, and liver, but also the soul, which they called the ka. The ka was thought to be housed within the skull, and it was important to keep the ka healthy so that the person could live a long and prosperous life. By removing a portion of the skull, it was believed that the ka would be able to function properly. It's also worth mentioning that the ancient Egyptians weren't the only civilization to come up with this idea. The practice of trepanation can be found all over the world. Some of the oldest examples of trepanation come from the Stone Age, and it's believed that the practice was used independently by many different cultures throughout history. However, none of these civilizations developed the practice quite like the Egyptians did. The Egyptian methods. In order to perform trepanation, the Egyptians would use a special tool called a trephine. This was an instrument that was designed to drill a hole into the skull. It looks a bit like a medieval drill bit, and it was used by placing it over the area of the skull where the hole was needed. It was then rotated rapidly until a hole was made. This sounds simple enough, but it takes a great deal of skill to use a trephine properly. If the hole is drilled too close to the brain, it could damage the brain itself. And if it's not done properly, the edges of the hole could be jagged and dangerous. The ancient Egyptians knew exactly where to place each hole so that the procedure would be as effective as possible. But once the hole was drilled, things got a little messy. You see, after the hole was drilled, the Egyptians would reach inside the skull and pull out the patient's brain. Well, at least some of it. It turns out that they didn't have the capability to remove the entire organ, so instead, they would simply pull out as much of the brain as they could through the hole in the skull. It was believed that by removing a portion of the brain, the evil spirits that caused illness would be freed and the patient would be cured. This might sound like a horrible and barbaric practice, but it's important to remember that the Egyptians weren't doing this out of cruelty. They genuinely believed that it would help their patients. There's also evidence to suggest that trepanation was seen as a rite of passage in some cases. There were even cases of young boys undergoing the procedure before they reached adulthood. This was likely done to help them control their emotions and behavior. The Egyptians believed that by removing part of the brain, the individual would be more in tune with their thoughts and actions. It sounds a bit extreme, but the truth is that many cultures throughout history have had strange and unusual beliefs about the brain and its functions. However, if the ancient Egyptians were actually trying to remove the brain, why didn't they just go ahead and take out the whole thing? There are a few reasons for this. First of all, the brain is a very delicate organ, and it was difficult for the Egyptians to remove it without damaging it. If the brain was damaged during the procedure, it could lead to infection or death. Secondly, the Egyptians didn't fully understand the function of the brain. They knew that it was important, but they didn't know exactly what it did. It's possible that they were afraid of accidentally removing a part of the brain that was responsible for something vital, such as breathing or movement. Finally, the Egyptians didn't want to leave their patients with a hole in their skull. As we mentioned earlier, the trephine could be dangerous if it was used improperly, and the last thing the Egyptians wanted was for their patients to die from infection or other complications. For these reasons, the Egyptians limited the amount of brain that they removed during trepanation. They only removed the parts that were causing the illness or other problems, and they tried to avoid damaging the brain itself. Wait a minute. So if the ancient Egyptians were actually trying to remove parts of the brain, why does it seem like they were making mistakes? Well, it turns out that they may have actually been doing what we would consider to be the wrong thing, but they probably thought they were doing the right thing. The problem is that we don't know exactly what the Egyptians were thinking when they performed these procedures. We can only rely on what we can observe from the physical evidence. This includes the mummies themselves, as well as the tools that were used during surgery. The removal of the brain. One of the most famous examples of Egyptian brain surgery comes from a mummy known as the man with two brains. The man with two brains was a high-status individual who lived in Thebes around 2,500 years ago. He underwent a procedure to remove a tumor from his brain. However, when his mummy was unwrapped in the early 1900s, it was discovered that both of his brains were still inside his skull. This might seem like a mistake, but it turns out that the Egyptians actually had a good reason for leaving the brain in place. The problem is that the tumor was located deep within the brain, and it was difficult to access without damaging the surrounding tissue. It's possible that the surgeon decided that it was too risky to attempt to remove the tumor and instead chose to leave it alone. This is supported by the fact that the brain appears to be otherwise healthy. The Egyptians didn't want to cause the patient any more harm than necessary, so they may have decided that leaving the tumor alone was the best course of action. Another piece of evidence that suggests the Egyptians may have understood the brain better than we think comes from the surgical instruments that were used on mummies. These instruments were designed to be as precise as possible so as to not damage the surrounding tissue. If the Egyptians were simply trying to remove parts of the brain, they wouldn't have needed such precise tools. They could have just gouged out as much of the organ as possible and been done with it. But the fact that they developed such sophisticated instruments suggests that they were trying to be as careful and accurate as possible during surgery. The debate continues. Despite all of the evidence, there are still a lot of questions about Egyptian brain surgery. We still don't know exactly what the Egyptians were thinking when they performed these procedures, and we don't know exactly how much they understood about the brain itself. It's possible that they were simply trying to treat illness and injury, and they believed that removing part of the brain would help their patients. Or it's possible that they had a much better understanding of the brain than we give them credit for. Either way, there's no denying that the ancient Egyptians were highly skilled surgeons who were willing to take on some of the most challenging procedures imaginable. They may have made mistakes, but they were operating under the best knowledge that they had available to them. And in many cases, they were successful in treating their patients. So while we may never know exactly what the Egyptians were trying to do when they removed parts of the brain, we can appreciate the skill and precision that they brought to the operating room. What do you think? Were the ancient Egyptians actually trying to remove parts of the brain, or was it all just a big mistake? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more videos like this one. Thanks for watching.